I'm Chip Freud, and this is the Artist Spotlight, conversations with contemporary artists based on 5 simple questions that explore the artist's journey, creativity, and sources of inspiration. Welcome to another episode of the Artist Spotlight podcast. Today I'm joined by fellow photographer David Blevins. David is a nature photographer, author, and ecologist. He combines a sense of wonder with an artistic eye to create images that tell stories about the meaning and significance of the natural world. He received a PhD in forest ecology at the University of British Columbia, as well as a bachelor and master's in forest science right here at North Carolina State University. I've really been looking forward to this conversation with you, David, as it was your workshop 10 years ago that helped kickstart my creative journey as a photographic artist. So, David, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
So why don't you help level set our audience by letting them know current project you may be working on. What are you spending your creative energies on right now?
Well, the thing that I just finished is a small little thing that I did in my backyard. This fall, we had just really spectacular colors in the backyard. I've got about a half acre of a wooded area behind my house. And this year, the colors were spectacular. And so I just spent a little bit of time in the backyard making some images, mostly of birds, but using all that spectacular fall color as backgrounds. And for me, wildlife photography, the background is just as important as the subject in the wildlife image. And so I was pretty happy with the results, and because it's my own yard and I have plenty of time to see everything, I could learn the patterns and favorite perches and do the sort of preparatory work that you have to do before you can actually make a really good wildlife image. And then the other thing is, since I'm here all the time, I can do that work when the light's the best. Over the, I guess, 3 or 4 weeks when the color was at its best, there were probably 4 or 5 days when the light was at its best, and the birds were here, and everything came together. And so I had some really nice results. Sort of the vision I have for those kind of images is, like the Japanese style of painting where there's, like almost a 2-dimensional tree branch with maybe a few flowers on it. And then the background is just a solid, just the paper. Like there's not even anything painted in the background often. And that sort of very abstract pattern is sort of the vision in my head of the kind of ideal picture of a bird perched in a tree branch, just trying to really simplify down get rid of any distraction and just have a bird in sort of a characteristic pose, not just any pose, but the sort of pose that bird strikes when it's being itself, not when it's, afraid that somebody's pointing a camera at it, but when it's in a natural state of mind and it's going about its business and it's on a branch, and that branch on its own looks good, and the background behind the bird contributes to all of that. And anyway, there's a lot of parts that have to come together, and it's one thing to do that out in the field, in the wild, and have all that come together. But yeah, in my backyard, it was pretty fun to have all that come together. But the key thing was the fall colors, and the fall colors are all gone now. And I have gone out there a couple times to try to do this again without the color, and it's not the same. I think I can do it. It's just a matter of the options are a lot less now. Like the places where the backgrounds are interesting and can contribute to the image, not just be something that doesn't distract from the image, but for the background to actually contribute to the image. It's a little harder to pull off without the color, but anyway, it's a fun little side project to do around the house.
And will that collection of images have a life beyond just the personal creative project?
Well, I mean, you never know. In a future project, I might end up needing an image from a little side project like that. In my mind, that's mostly just to sort of keep the creative juices flowing and to not get rusty, and also to just work on ideas. So I've never actually achieved this sort of Japanese style abstract 2-dimensional look. I've never actually achieved that. I think if I really dedicated myself to making that image, I could do it. But I'm not just trying to do that. I'm trying to sort of combine that with wildlife photography, and the animals have a pretty big say in what I can do.
Yeah.
So I've never actually been able to do it. So just, having a few more tries, seeing how close I can get. It's fun. That's it. It was just fun. And it's possible that I could use one of these images in a future book, but it's not, it doesn't often happen because, when I'm working on a book, the book has its own needs, and the images pretty much have to be created for that book specifically. So it's rare that I just so happen to have already made a picture that works in a book. I pretty much have to create an image for a book for that book specifically. And so it's hard to make the image until I even know what the book is.
Oh, good point. Good point. Well, this podcast is really all about our 5 questions. And the first is, what is your earliest memory of making art of any kind?
Of any kind. Well, I suspect I was probably drawing pictures before I can remember. But the first memory I have of trying to draw a picture, I was probably 7 or 8, I'm guessing. And I remember I was trying to draw a mountain, and I asked my father, "Do mountains have roots?" And the reason I asked that was because I was wondering, do mountains grow like trees grow? Like I didn't understand how a mountain got there. But he didn't hear it in the way I was asking. He just thought, well, yeah, mountains have plants on them, and so there are roots on mountains. And so his answer to my question, do mountains have roots, was yes, they do. And so then I drew my picture, and it was a mountain with roots under it like a tree would have. And and then I showed it to him, and he's like, no, 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 that's not right. But I think you could see, I can, looking back on that memory, I could see how in my mind I was trying to work out how to draw a picture of a mountain that didn't just show the mountain, but showed how that mountain worked. And I didn't, and I got it wrong, but you could still see that's what I was trying to do, is it was more than just the mountain. It was how that mountain got to be there. And so that idea of learning about my subjects and trying to incorporate what I've learned into the image is something I still do now. I think that's like the core of what I do now. But you could see it in that oldest memory I have of drawing. um, I could see that same process happening, even though I got it wrong.
Although in some ways, conceptually, I love the image as it comes to my mind, just as you describe it, because in a sense, it's telling you that the mountain is a living thing,
Hmm.
but in reality, it's a living system of things.
Hmm.
But you know, I just love that whole image that you've created with that.
Yeah, and the idea, like I didn't know about geology. Like the mountain did grow in a way, and it
Yeah.
it did have forces that contributed, that allowed it to be there. But yeah, I just was too young to know any of that, and I was trying to make sense out of the world. And yeah, and I think that struggle that I was having is still the struggle I have now, trying to make sense out of things, and and then once you do make some sense out of it, how can you share that with somebody else in an image? And yeah, that's still the struggle I have now.
Hmm. Well, as we move on, your current medium is obviously photography. What brought you to photography, and what is it about it that keeps you going?
Well, I think I would say my current medium is actually, I would say, the coffee table book,
Ah,
not photography. And the reason I would make that distinction is because of what I was just mentioning, that when I have an idea for a book, that book idea then starts to have a life of its own, and it tells me the kind of images it needs. And then I go and I make the images for that book specifically. And if I don't have a book that I'm working on, then those ideas don't come. And so yes, I'm a nature photographer, but in a larger, more holistic sense, producing a coffee table book. And it's because, a lot of coffee table books are a portfolio of an artist's work on a theme, and the book is conceived of after the work is completed, and it's just a way to show that artist's portfolio. And that's just not what I'm doing. Like what I'm doing is, I have an idea that I think is important that I want to share with people, and just the pictures by themselves can't convey everything. I need some text along with it. And the coffee table book format is the perfect way to do that. And so to me, the coffee table book is the actual thing I'm producing, and the images are subcomponents of that.
Excellent. At another time, I may try to pick your brain because I have a book idea, but I haven't the slightest idea of where to begin in creating a book.
Hmm.
There'll be another
It,
conversation.
yeah, we can have that conversation anytime. But in terms of your question about how I came
Yeah.
to make coffee table books, as opposed to how I came to make photographs, because I think how I came to make photographs is probably like everybody. Like I just started borrowing my dad's camera when I was, I think, around 13, just without his knowledge, and started shooting. This is back in the days of film, so I started shooting, print film, not even slide film, just shooting some whatever film was in the camera. Just started, and but the first subjects, I still have a copy of one of the very first images I ever shot when I was 13, and it's of a brown thrasher in the bushes, and it's a terrible picture, but I like to show that picture in talks so people can realize that I started in the same place everybody started. My pictures were terrible. But I was just attracted to nature, and the camera was a fun thing to capture some of those memories. And so I think that's not as interesting a story as how I got started in publishing coffee table books. And I think there, when I was working on my PhD, I had already had quite a few years to hone my photography skills, and I was able to produce publishable quality images by the time I was working on my PhD. And it took a long time to get to that point. And at this point, even though I could do it, I couldn't do it on demand. I would have to revisit a site probably 4 or 5 times before I finally got something that was publishable. Whereas now I can pretty reliably do that on the first visit. But back then, especially, this is still back in the days of film, you couldn't just look at the back of your camera and see that, oh, I messed that up, I need to do it again. You had to wait till you got the film processed and then realize, oh, I should have done that differently. And then you go back again. And so back in that day, I was at least at that early point where I felt like I could do a larger project and publish images. And this was around the time the internet was just getting started, and I got curious about web pages. And so I just said, "Oh, I want to learn how you make a web page. I'll just make one." I had no idea what I was going to put on it. I just wanted to learn the technology and how to do it. So, and I had these pictures, so I said, "Well, I'll just put my pictures on a web page." And in that day, a lot of the serious photographers, a lot of professional photographers wouldn't put their images on web pages because they didn't want them to be taken for free. And so I had at that time there weren't a lot of images, good quality images online. And so I started selling images almost immediately as soon as I started putting things up. The first image I ever sold was to an Icelandic newspaper of a red admiral butterfly image that I shot in Pullen Park in Raleigh on my way walking to class one day when I was in college. And it's just because I uploaded it to my website. Well, anyway, there was a local author. This is while I was working on my PhD in British Columbia, in Vancouver, and there was a local author who was working on a book on Boundary Bay, which is a huge intertidal bay south of Vancouver that the U.S.-Canada border runs through. That's why it's called Boundary Bay. And so she was working on a book on that area, and she had seen my pictures on my website of that area. And I had been attracted to that area because that's where all the biological diversity is around
Mhm.
Vancouver. Most of the time you think about Vancouver and you think about those mountains north of the city with the snow on top and the old growth forests. And that's what I imagined I would be spending my time in. But when I actually got there, there's not a lot of biological diversity up in those mountains. There's 3 tree species, and you can go hiking all day long and see 3 birds. And I don't mean 3 bird species, I mean 3 individual birds. But Boundary Bay to the south of Vancouver is full of life. It's a huge intertidal bay. It's really important for migratory birds. And so that's where all the action was as far as I was concerned. And so I was just out there anytime I could get a chance to get away from my studies and making nature pictures. And anyway, this local author had seen the pictures, and she asked, I would help her with her book on Boundary Bay. And as I was saying earlier, I have a tendency to, overthink things. And I could have just said, sure, here are my pictures, use whatever you like. That's all I really needed to say. But instead, I said, sure, let's have a meeting and tell me about your book, and we'll work out what images you need for that book, and I'll make them. And see, that's a different thing.
Mhm.
Instead of just giving her the images I had and continuing to make images that she could possibly use, to actually think through what would be the ideal images to show in this book that would help with what you're trying to achieve. And that's just the way my brain works, I think. And so while I was working on my PhD, I gave myself this huge job of making the images for her book. And that's how this whole thing got started. And we weren't able to find a publisher for that book. You know, as you can imagine, a guidebook for Boundary Bay, there's not a big market. You pretty
Mm.
much have to be in that area to want a guidebook for Boundary Bay. And so we weren't able to find a publisher, but she was interested in starting her own publishing business. And so she started the publishing business where she could publish other authors that were doing similar regional type work. And so that was how that book got published, is she published it herself. But it was a good start, and it gave me a taste for what it felt like to make images with a purpose and to contribute to some larger project like that. And so by the time my PhD was finished and that book was finished, I was certain that I wanted to do another book. And then it's just a question of what ideas to work on. And but that was my introduction to the whole concept. But at the same time, it was my own tendencies that led me there, because I could have just said, "Oh, sure, here's the pictures, use them."
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you first for the clarification of, how you really view your work and the medium that you're working in. And then that, that was a great story on what brought you through that process. You've already touched on this next question a little bit, but maybe we can dig into it a bit deeper. And that is, what inspires your work? Where does it come from?
I think that hasn't really changed for since I was 13 and I first picked up a camera. I think it's always been the same thing, and that would be a sense of wonder. And it's an emotional feeling you get when you just look at things, and it makes me want to make a picture of them. And I guess I should be clear about what I mean by a sense of wonder, because wonder is not a terribly well understood emotion. I did some reading on wonder a while back, but one of the best things I found was Emily Dickinson wrote a poem, and the title is "Wonder is Not Precisely Knowing." It's this sort of,
Hmm.
it's when you look at something and it grabs your attention, you don't quite understand what it is. That's, I think, the core of where wonder is coming from. And so for me, just that feeling alone is enough to make me want to make a picture, but it also makes me want to learn about the subject. And then once I've learned about the subject, that makes me also want to make an image that shows what I've learned. And it doesn't have to be book learning. Like if you imagine a wildlife photograph, like I was mentioning photographing the birds earlier, if you think about something like a white-breasted nuthatch, they like to feed running down the the trunk of a tree. And they have this characteristic pose where they'll stop and look around, and their body is pointed down, but they point their head out perpendicular to the tree trunk. And that's sort of a characteristic white-breasted nuthatch pose. And if you just spend some time with them, you'll see them do that over and over again. And there's all kinds of poses they can strike, but that one pose they return to over and over again. So to me, that's an example of something you can learn that's just purely visual. It's not, like something from a textbook. It's just something purely visual that you can learn about your subject and incorporate that into your image. But the wonder, I think, is where it all starts. It starts in and of itself as a motivation to make an image, but also it starts the learning process that creates the knowledge that then informs later pictures.
No, I love the cyclical element of that it feeds back on itself and further creates additional creative juices. I love that.
Yeah, and you never run out of wonder either, because no matter how much science you apply to something, there's always a limit where it's like, okay, well, we don't know any more about that. That's it. There's always something left that's unknown where you can still have wonder.
Very cool. Well, what advice would you give to an artist or a coffee table book creator just starting out?
I think probably the most important thing, and this doesn't just apply to people just starting out, but I think this is probably the most important thing, is to have an appreciation of the role of failure in motivating you to improve. So, in other words, I've seen people just starting out, like people will come to a photography workshop and, they're literally just starting out with a camera. And the gulf between the images they can make and the images they think are good, not there's no objective good image, but in their mind, they have their own personal taste on what they like. And the gulf between the images they like and what they can do is so huge, it's discouraging.
Mm.
And it can cause you to give up. But you need that feeling because that is what guides you to work on something, to improve what you're doing, to close that gap. And so it's particularly important for somebody just starting out to not let that discourage you and to realize it might take you a few years to work through enough where you can finally make one image that is up to your own tastes for what you think makes a good image. You might not be able to do it every time, but if you've done it once after about a couple years, I think that's good. But the other issue, the reason I say this is something even for people who aren't just starting out, is this is a moving target because the more you learn and the closer you get to that target, your standards start to go up.
Mhm.
And now you're sort of aiming at this moving target, and there's this constant discouraging feeling that you're just not good enough. You can't do the thing, but you just have to realize that you absolutely need that feeling as your guide for what it is you're working on. And if you can imagine not having that feeling, if you can imagine taking your first photograph and thinking, that's perfect, I'm amazing, then you're never going to get any better.
Right.
That's it. That's all you're ever going to be. So you have to have that discouraging feeling, and you just have to start treating it as the most important part of your creative process, not as something to be discouraging.
If you've done your best work, what do you have to look forward to?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's one of the greatest things about photography, but also art in general, is that you will never finish that journey.
Yeah.
Like there's always more to improve on, and to yeah, it's for a creative person to run out of things to be working on, that would be terrible. So that's the
Yeah.
nice thing, is you'll never run out of this process.
Very true. Very true. Well, what are one of the things I like to ask each of the folks that come on the show is, who are some other artists that you would recommend that people go check out? Whose work, maybe somebody you just discovered or somebody you go back to time and time again for inspiration?
Well, as you can imagine, producing a coffee table book is requires a lot of different skills. And so there's different artists that I go to for inspiration for writing versus photography versus more philosophical ideas. So, and also, even I guess with photography, it kind of depends, where I am in terms of photography. So like there was a time when I got interested in manipulating light. So not just working with natural light, but manipulating light. And I looked around to try to just find images where the light was manipulated in a way that impressed me. And that it didn't look manipulated, that it just looked like amazing light. And so Joe McNally is
Yeah.
a famous photographer. He's amazing at manipulating light, and he wrote a book, I think it's called The Moment It Clicks. And so I was able to learn how to manipulate light from that book. And I don't often manipulate light in my nature photography because the natural light is part of what's amazing to me about nature.
Mhm. Mhm.
But occasionally I'm in situations where I do need to manipulate light. And so it's really good to understand how to do that. But that's like a very narrow thing. But if you're interested in the more technical sides of photography, then finding somebody like Joe McNally to teach you how to manipulate light is very valuable. But overall, I think in terms of photographers, I would probably say Franz Lanting
Mm.
is probably the photographer that I most identify with. When I was first getting started, his images just, I was amazed. I couldn't even understand how he was able to make the image. But more important than that is he was choosing subjects that I would also have chosen. So he had the same sort of sense of what was worth photographing, but then he did it in an amazing way. And so just studying his work helped me close the gap between what I could do and what he was doing. But it also helped raise the bar too, because he
Sure.
was doing things that were better than I could have imagined. So like if I had managed to make an image as good as I can imagine, it still wouldn't have been as good as what he was doing. So yeah, Franz Lanting is definitely somebody to check out. And then I guess another one, this is the artist that I've recently been researching is Caspar David Friedrich. Do you know him?
No, it's
He's like a he's a landscape painter from the early 1800s in Germany,
hmm.
but he was part of this movement to sort of almost a rebellion against the Enlightenment, to find some more emotional core to things as religion was becoming less important as the Enlightenment was making science
Hmm.
more important. But anyway, his work is all about the sublime, and I haven't done a lot of reading on the sublime. The sublime is kind of related to wonder, but sublime's a lot bigger subject than
Hmm.
wonder.
Yeah.
And there's more. It's not just something you don't understand. It's not, and it's not just beautiful. It's also, terrible. It's, horrifying, can be sublime. It's a bigger topic. But Caspar David Friedrich painted landscapes that they're amazing landscape images, and you definitely get a feeling of the sublime from those images. And so just that's one thing I'm curious about is I've always been focused on wonder. Sublime is a slightly larger sort of canvas to think about, and I'm considering, can I incorporate any of that into what I'm doing? And part of the issue that I have is, my sense of wonder for nature comes from seeing nature in its healthy, pristine state. And it's harder and harder to find
Hmm.
places that inspire me. And especially the more I've learned about ecology and about how humans have altered the landscape, the harder it is for me to become inspired. And, like one of my coffee table books called Wild North Carolina, and it's all about what the North Carolina landscape was like in its natural state. And so to make that book, I had to find all the best remaining examples of the natural landscapes that remain in North Carolina. And that was a really hard thing to do. It was really hard to find the few places that are left. And you might think, well, we have lots of parks. The closest park to me is Umstead State Park, but most of Umstead State Park is pine forest that grew up on agricultural fields that were abandoned after the Great Depression. That's not what was here originally. And so the more you learn about ecology and how we've changed the landscape, it's just the harder it gets for me to be inspired and to have that sense of wonder. But this idea of the sublime, you know, it it involves it involves something greater. I guess in these Friedrich paintings, nature, you get the sense that humans are small and unable to dominate nature. And I think that's what's attracted me to his work is from my personal experience and in the part of the world that I live in, humans are absolutely dominating nature. And this concept that there are clearly are elements of nature that we can't control,
Hmm.
but I'm just trying to find some way to tap into that emotional core of what motivates me to make an image, even though I'm spending most of my time in an environment that doesn't do that for me anymore. Like when I was 13 and just getting started, I was in the same kind of heavily manipulated landscape. I just didn't know it. So it was plenty inspiring because it was all sense of wonder everywhere I looked. But that's the struggle I have now is trying to find that sense of wonder in a landscape that's so altered and damaged and threatened.
Well, thank you, David. Those are some wonderful recommendations. I look forward to exploring uh, the the last artist in particular. Was it Casper?
Caspar David Friedrich.
Friedrich. Okay. Looking forward to it because, of course, I know the other two well. Well, we want to make sure that folks can check out your work. And coming up in January 25th, you're giving a talk at the Cary Art Center from 7 to 8:30. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, I was going to talk about my most recent two coffee table books. One of them is called Wild North Carolina, and it's about, like I mentioned before, all the best remaining natural areas in North Carolina. It's based on the science of community ecology. Um, but the premise is a natural community is basically the way plants and animals organize themselves on the landscape. The plants and animals that live at the top of the hill are different than the ones that live down in the river valley. And these patterns, if you were just walking around this landscape 500 years ago, you would have seen these patterns for yourself. But today, these patterns are all obscured by manipulations from human activity. And so it's hard to piece together what the landscape used to be like. But there's a field of science and there's a group of scientists that have done that. And that's what that book is based on, is it's turning their work into a coffee table book that anybody can appreciate. And the premise of the photographs is not just to go to the locations that are the best remaining examples of all the different natural communities, but it's to create compositions that are based on the patterns that are characteristic of those communities. And so that's sort of the fundamental basis of the landscape photographs for that book. And then the second book is North Carolina's Barrier Islands. That's a book about, well, obviously the Barrier Islands, but it's about how those barrier islands form and move, and how that all connects with the plants and animals that are adapted to live there. And the point of that book, I think, is to give people a better appreciation for how the dynamics of those islands shape the plants and animals that live there, and how important all those connections are. And a lot of the human activity on those islands is fighting against those forces.
Yeah.
So an appreciation for what good those forces do, I think, is important. The core of the talk will be summarizing sort of what those two books are about, showing some examples, but also the thread running through all of it is some of the stuff we've been talking about here, of where the ideas come from, how that sort of thing is all put together. So I wanted to focus a little bit more on the creative process of creating the books, not just the books themselves.
Well, cool. And I'll make sure I put a link in the show notes to that talk so folks can get more information on that. And of course, they can find your work on your website, blevinsphoto.com, and on your Facebook page and Instagram. And I'll link those two in the show notes, make it easy for folks to find. So this has been delightful to get reconnected, David, after 10 years. Hopefully it won't take another 10 years for us to get together. I've actually already registered for your talk on the 25th, so I will be there in the audience, and hopefully others will be able to join us and learn a bit more about your work. And I just love the combination of art, photography, and science that you've put together. I think the whole area of science communication is one that is just so critically important these days, and you've got a really unique approach to it.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that.
This concludes another episode of the Artist Spotlight. Tune in next time for another conversation with a contemporary artist. Thank you for joining us. This has been the Artist Spotlight with Chip Freund. Find accompanying blog posts at chipfreundphoto.com/blog, and you may subscribe to our show on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like listening.